One thing that I was not aware of until this whole discussion began, really in earnest a few years ago, was some of the unintended consequences of opening up CPA licensure laws in the different states. And I see you all are nodding your heads. There have been attempts in the past to deregulate our profession. And Shelly, I'm going to turn to you for this one. What are the unintended consequences of making this change? What are the threats we may not be aware of as CPAs when we start changing our licensure rules?
Yeah, it's a great question. My colleagues and peers that are listening around the country are probably chuckling, knowing that you were going to toss this to me because I'm always the one that's like, okay, we got to be careful, guys. In certain political climates, and it really is a bipartisan issue, but it's especially prominent in the what I call the deep red states like Florida, and some of my peers around the South, Jody Ann as well. There is kind of this broader, to your point, Blake, deregulation, anti-licensure environment. And it's rooted in it being a pro-business and being business friendly, meaning the Republican Party, by and large, wants to take away red tape and bureaucratic barriers that might exist for people to become licensed and get to work in various states. And a lot of times they may not be targeting our profession specifically for these efforts that they're putting forth. However, we get kind of coupled into it together because of the broader occupational licensing reform. So when you open up your statute, it comes with inherent risk because once you have your statute open, anybody can start introducing language or amendments or changes during your legislative process. And they might do it at the 11th hour, like what my dear friend Ron in Louisiana experienced a couple of years ago. And so the value of the state CPA societies and both the offensive and defensive posturing that we do to protect and promote the license in our respective states is incredibly important because in many of these situations, there are these unintended consequences where we get roped into something that we may not be the target of specifically, but is a larger deregulation movement. There are some very scary bills that have already been filed in several states this legislative session that could cripple our regulatory infrastructure if we're not careful. And the other thing I would mention, Blake, and this gets a little bit in the weeds again, but it's important for especially the students and the candidates on the phone to understand. I think Jen said this a minute ago. You're dealing with 55 different jurisdictions who have different timing on both their legislative session or what their particular process is for rules. So, for example, Ohio has a year long legislative session, Michigan has a year long legislative session. Jody Ann has a 60-day session every other year. So our window and sort of the timing of when the societies and the state boards can both introduce and pass legislation is very dependent on what's happening in our states. So I know Calvin's hot button question is the lowering of the standards. My little nitpicky thing is I get really irritated when I see things online about, oh, such and such state is following this state or following that. It's like, no, no, no. There's been 30 plus states working together for the better part of the year on all of these concepts, all of our peers around the country who I'm giving a giant hug to right now, that aren't on the phone to advance this together and do it with as minimal pain as possible. We just have to do it within the timeframes of when our state legislative session or our rulemaking process allows.